Israeli politicians are expected to debate bills that could ban the UN Agency for Palestinian Refugees from operating within Israel. So it would also significantly restrict its activities across the occupied West Bank. 7 countries, including the UK, France, Germany, Canada, have all issued a joint statement expressing their grave concern of the plans. Here's a closer look at UNRWA. The United Nations Relief and Works Agency for Palestine Refugees was created in 1949 to support Palestinians forcibly displaced in 1948. And that was because of the creation of Israel, known by Palestinians as the Nakba, or the catastrophe. Today, UNRWA supports nearly 6 million Palestinian refugees in 58 camps across Gaza, the occupied West Bank, Jordan, Lebanon, and Syria. As of last year, 545,000 children were enrolled in UNRWA's 709 schools. The agency also runs 140 primary healthcare facilities. More than 30,000 Palestinians work for the agency across the Middle East, while nearly the entire population in Gaza now relies on UNRWA for its most basic needs. Mohammed Jamjoom joining us from Jordan's capital, Amman, because the Israeli government has banned Al Jazeera from reporting inside Israel and in the occupied West Bank. Mohammed, what more do we know about these bills?
So, Danny, it's expected that these 2 bills will be voted on at some point today in the Knesset, Israel's parliament. This, of course, is the opening day of the Knesset's winter session, and it's being reported in the Israeli media that the lawmakers will go ahead and debate these measures today and vote on these 2 very controversial bills. Now, if these bills pass, they would, among other things, severely restrict, if not outright ban, the activities of UNRWA, which is the UN Refugee Agency for Palestinians, in both the occupied East Jerusalem and the occupied West Bank. That's just a few of the things it would do. Now, one of the reasons this is so concerning to people is that this would have a massive impact on humanitarian programs, on health programs, on medical programs for all these Palestinians, not just in the occupied West Bank, not just in occupied East Jerusalem, but also in Gaza. This would also potentially strip privileges and immunities from UN staff for UNRWA in those areas. So this would be a huge detrimental move against UNRWA by the Israelis if indeed this does pass. And if it does pass, if the second and third readings of these bills pass today, that would mean that these would go into effect within 3 months from today. Now, as you mentioned before, there's been a huge international outcry. You've had that statement from these foreign ministers of countries like France and Canada and the UK and South Korea, in which they've expressed grave concern, especially in light of the humanitarian catastrophe that is unfolding in Gaza. Beyond that, just in the past hour, we've seen a statement from the Office of the Palestinian Presidency, and I'm just going to read you a portion of that statement, which says, "If it were not for the continuous American political, financial, and military support for the occupation, it would not have dared to challenge the international community and adopt policies that drowned the region in violence and instability." This statement is saying that doing this to UNRWA is a red line and that the refugee issue is the core of the Palestinian issue. Obviously, we don't have a lot of concrete details at this hour as to when precisely these bills may be debated today. We're going by reports in the Israeli media. They do suggest that the Israeli members of the Knesset are going to go ahead with this today, and that by perhaps tonight, these 2 bills may have passed their second and third readings.
Okay, Mohammed, we'll check in with you a little later, but for the time being, thank you so much for that reporting from Amman. We can now speak to Chris Gunness, who's a former spokesman for UNRWA, joining us from London. Chris Gunness, thanks for your time. How concerning is this for you if these bills were to pass?
This is another serious assault by the State of Israel on the international rule of law and the international system itself, and it is completely illegal. It's illegal on 4 grounds. Firstly, it's a violation of Article 105 of the UN Charter, which requires member states to grant privileges and immunities to UN organizations. Those would simply be removed. Secondly, it's a violation of the 1948 Convention on the Privileges and Immunities of the United Nations, which spells out what those P&Is, as they're called, are, such as tax exemptions, the ability to hold bank accounts, the ability to lease property. Thirdly, it's a violation of the rules of belligerent occupation, under which Israel, as the occupying power, is obliged to deliver the services which existed before the occupation to the occupied population. So it's called the status quo ante must be respected by Israel. And of course, UNRWA had been working in Gaza and the West Bank since 1950. It became operational in May 1950. This is also, fourthly, a violation of the Genocide Convention, as under the provisional measures of the 26th of January this year, Israel is obliged to facilitate the delivery of international humanitarian aid, and attempting to end the operations of the largest provider of humanitarian aid is clearly a violation of those measures. To be clear, national legislation does not negate Israel's international obligations. And very lastly, this is premised on the notion that UNRWA staff took place in the 7th of October attacks. And though Israel has made these repeated allegations, both the external report by the former French Foreign Minister Catherine Colonna and the internal UN report has failed to find any conclusive evidence to substantiate Israel's claims. So it's illegal on 4 counts, and it's based on what I've been calling the mother of all lies.
Okay, hang on. I'd like to talk to you about some of the reaction that's come through from Western countries. But before we get onto that, just describe to our viewers what this would mean if UNRWA was banned from operating within Israel and its activities severely restricted in the occupied West Bank. What would that mean for Palestinians who rely on UNRWA as a lifeline, really?
Well, for the Palestinians in the Gaza Strip, 2.3 or so million of them, it would be a humanitarian apocalypse. It would mean that nearly 2 million people who are desperately in need of food aid, they're in deep, deep food insecurity, sliding towards starvation. They would slide further towards starvation. It would mean that UNRWA, which is attempting to provide humanitarian services, life-saving services to the 400,000 people who are being forced from northern Gaza into the south, where there isn't enough food, enough housing, enough desalinated water, enough electricity. It would mean that the backbone of the response to that population's forced displacement would effectively be broken. In the longer term, it means that 650,000 children would be deprived of an education, both in Gaza and, by the way, in the West Bank, because UNRWA, along with the Hamas education ministry, had been the biggest provider of education services. So in the short term, it means a humanitarian apocalypse. And in the longer term, it means the withholding of humanitarian services to potentially millions of people who desperately need life-saving services, not just now, but in the long run.
Okay, and when it comes to the international community, they've some countries, UK, France, Canada, Germany, all expressing their grave concern. I mean, you were listing a number of violations, as well as explaining why this move would be illegal by Israel. So what do you expect, or what do you call for these countries to do who are concerned about any potential moves by Israel?
Before I get on to that, let me say very quickly, there is something very fundamental happening here. The far-right Israeli politicians have been very clear that what they call Judea and Samaria, the land from the River Jordan to the Mediterranean Sea, is for the Jews. And by implication, there should be no Palestinians. And of course, if UNRWA exists, the organization which the international community has created to serve those Palestinians, then of course that ethnic cleansing can't happen. So big picture, what I fear is that we're seeing is part of the ethnic cleansing of Palestine. This is also an attack on Palestinian self-determination, which has been declared illegal by the International Court of Justice. And it's an attempt to remove 5.9 million refugees that UNRWA serves out of the international discourse. But of course, even if UNRWA disappeared this morning, the refugees would remain people with individual and collective rights, including the right to self-determination. So 6 million people can't just be airbrushed out of history because the Knesset passes a couple of bills. It's also a unilateral attack on the peace process, because if there is ever going to be a just and lasting, durable peace, the plight of these 6 million people must be resolved. To be clear, the Middle East will remain an inherently unstable place, and Israel will remain an inherently insecure place unless the plight of these refugees are brought out of their statelessness and dispossession. And finally, it's an attack on multilateralism itself. Because if we accept that Israel can acquire land by force and clear it of its people, well, Putin can do that in eastern Ukraine.
Okay, so will countries take steps to stop this? Those countries that have spoken out now and said they are gravely concerned?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, you quoted that joint statement by those countries. I think we're going to see serious pressure applied to Israel, because countries know very well that the sort of things I'm saying, which many of them dare not say, but let's be clear and speak truth to power, massive, massive issues are at stake. It's not just about a UN organization, it's about the world system. So, if those countries care about the international system, the international rule of law, I think they will. I think that, we've seen the Germans, the Canadians, the Americans, the Brits and others, which you've said, and I think it's also an obligation on them because of the Genocide Convention. Third states have an obligation to make sure that the Genocide Convention is respected. That might also kick in. But let's be clear, as we speak, Palestinian civil society are mounting a serious campaign, a well-coordinated campaign, to have Israel kicked out of the General Assembly, as apartheid South Africa was kicked out of the General Assembly about 50 years ago. And this attack in the Knesset, I think, is going to add considerable weight to those arguments. And, if Israel is not careful, its pariah status is going to be confirmed. And I think those supporters of Israel that you listed, those countries, know very well that that is what is at stake. And I think there'll be huge pressure applied.
Okay, Chris Gunness, we thank you for joining us on Al Jazeera.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Make sure to subscribe to our channel to get the latest news from Al Jazeera.